So, thinking about the contact center specifically, Eric, and thinking about some of the use cases that we hear about, and some of the things that we've read about, some ways that it would be best used in a contact center. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking stuff like setting up next best action, agent assist type use cases. Maybe using vibe coding to polish up, workflows and things that perhaps already exist. But maybe this would make it a little bit easier for people to test them and see if they're headed down the right path. In daily life here at AMC, is that sort of where you've seen vibe coding work the best?
So one of the best ways to use it is something that is a smaller context and a smaller achievable goal. So for example, maybe you're going to say integrate with Salesforce and you want to make an Apex class do something. You can typically generate an Apex class because it's normally only 1 to 2 files for what you need to accomplish very quickly and very easily.
So for the uninitiated, what is an Apex class?
Apex class is a traditional coding language that is used in Salesforce. It's based off of their Apex programming language. And Apex class is typically, just for the layman, is a file that contains the code that you would be using. And so it allows you as a normal person who's experienced with code and Salesforce to basically generate a more complex functionality that you can then upload to your Salesforce environment and use. You can also use it for generating the Salesforce flows XML formatting or YAML formatting, I can't remember which it is. So you can get something that is more complex and that would take more time to manually pull up everything, and you can leverage some of the strong points of AI, which is being able to remember and iterate very quickly on the details, the fine details, specifically what was the name of that function I wanted to call that Salesforce exposes, what was the name of that field on that object inside Salesforce, and you can very quickly pull all of that together in a conversational way and get a usable experience for something that typically would have taken, reading documentation and then also, making sure and testing your code to make sure it's actually pulling the right data. This just goes from conversation test until you have your final product that you want to use. Now, like I've said, you still have to be careful and you have to make sure that what you're generating is explicitly what you need to use and it's safe and it's, not necessarily AI slop, as some people like to call, but you can certainly, with the right guidelines and with the right guidance to the AI, you can generate some really useful and really good tools very quickly.
So, Eric, at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about how the barrier of entry for getting something off the ground floor is really lower than it's ever been. We also touched on some of the horror stories that we've read about, things going awry once it's pushed into production because the correct processes and guardrails are not in place. Now, you can push something to production using vibe coding and let's say that nothing goes wrong. However, I would guess that all of the applications that this vibe coded piece that has been made, they're going to receive their own updates. They're going to be receiving their own maintenance from the various organizations that maintain those. Your piece, however, if you are not paying attention, is not going to be receiving those updates and maintenance. So you keep reading in the news that software engineers and developer teams, we don't need them anymore. However, I'm going to guess that in these situations, having them in place and having them paying attention to these things probably would have mitigated a lot of these issues and would mitigate further issues. Am I right on that?
Yeah, so what you see nowadays, especially in the news with people who are like, my vibe-coded application, when I let the agent do something, deleted my entire database. Or it did something, reckless. It caused an outage and it broke a core service, or my application no longer builds. These are, things that if you don't have a traditional development background, you can get yourself into a situation where you just keep prompting the AI to try and fix it. You just keep burning tokens, and you can end up sometimes in a loop, which, it's very intimidating to get out of if you're not a technical individual. In my biased opinion as a developer or software engineer, I still think you need a software engineering team. Now, you might not need as many as you did in the past because people are accelerated and can do more. But I do genuinely believe that you need people with technical backgrounds who know software and know how to write it in order to maintain these applications. Because if you're developing more application, more lines of code, faster and more frequently, you need people to be able to check those and make sure that it's actually, something that is being developed in a way that is clean and consistent. Because a lot of times AI, when it likes to write code, it likes to write really, really long functions that are, typically not what a human developer would call easy to understand. And another thing with AI is when you tell it to debug these really, really long functions, it actually struggles. So you need your engineering team to keep it in a situation where it's keeping things small and concise and easy to understand in terms of how you're writing the code, and keeping things isolated to logical groupings and pairings of code that is related to itself, and separating out stuff that's unrelated into other files and other locations in your actual project. And you end up in a situation where if you don't do that, you end up with these massive files that are really hard to debug as a human being. And especially if you're not technical, it's just borderline impossible to properly maintain. So vibe coding is a great tool. You need to have the right skill set to use it.